Before starting the next lesson, try this warm-up. Factor each of these expressions. So based on what you learned in the previous lesson, try to factor these, pause the video, and come back to see how you do. And here you go. 3x squared minus 10x plus 8. 3 is not a common factor, so this is a complex trinomial. I decompose the middle term. So I need two numbers that add up to minus 10x and multiply to 3 times 8, which is 24. Okay, so that's where those numbers came from. Then factor by grouping. First two terms, greatest common factor is 3x. I'm left with x minus 2. Last two terms, the greatest common factor is minus 4. I'm left with x minus 2. X minus 2 is a greatest common factor now. I'm left with 3x minus 4 as my other factor. Over here, 5x squared minus 30x minus 35. Watch out. Greatest common factor is 5. Do that first. Then you're left with a simple trinomial. All you need to find is two numbers that multiply to minus 7 and add to minus 6. If you tried to treat this as a complex trinomial, you probably ran into some difficulties and you might not have had a fully factored form at the end. So just be careful, always be on the lookout to see if you can do common factoring first. Now let's move on to the lesson. We're looking at solving quadratic equations. So by the end of this lesson, I'm hoping that you'll be able to solve quadratic equations by choosing the most efficient method. And we're going to talk about solving by factoring or the quadratic formula. So this is why in the warm-up I got you to practice factoring, because we're going to be factoring in order to solve equations. Now all of the equations that we're going to be solving are going to be in this form. Ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So you might recognize this as a complex trinomial. But we have to have this part here equals 0. That's very important, as you'll see as we keep going. So when we have an equation written in this form, this is a quadratic equation and we can solve it. Well, you can solve it by graphing, but we're going to focus on factoring or the quadratic formula. Now just a note about graphing. If my equation is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, and I make a graph of a function equal to ax squared plus bx plus c, well, where on the graph is that function equal to 0? At the x-intercepts. So if you graph your equation and you find the x-intercepts, that will give you your answers for x. So this is why I'm not really going to talk a whole lot about graphing, because it doesn't take a lot of skill. We're going to focus on factoring or quadratic formula. So in this first example, I'm going to solve by factoring. 25x squared minus 36 equals 0. Now, I already showed you how you can solve this by factoring. So I just took the left-hand side of the equation and turned it into a function, plugged it into my Desmos graphing calculator, it made the graph, and I just found the x-intercepts. So I know x is equal to negative 1.2 or positive 1.2. I know there's going to be two different answers to solve this equation. But let's work through solving by factoring here. 25x squared minus 36 equals 0. It's important that you have it equal to 0 before you begin factoring. Otherwise, it's not going to work out. Okay, so it's equal to 0. That's done. Now I look at the left-hand side. This is a binomial. It's a difference. Are these squares? Well, yep. This is 5 squared, x squared. 36 is 6 squared, so I have a difference of squares. I'm not going to go through how to factor this in detail because that was covered in the previous lesson. So if you still are struggling with factoring, I do recommend you do some more practice, go back to the previous lesson, ask me questions, whatever you need to get comfortable with it. So when I factor this difference of squares, I end up with 5x plus 6 times 5x minus 6. And remember, my equation is equal to 0. Now, if I want to solve this equation using my factored form, I have to look at this. I have something multiplied by something else, and my answer is 0. Well, hopefully you know that if you multiply two numbers and the answer is 0, one of your numbers has to be 0, or they're both equal to 0. So I can say either 5x plus 6 equals 0, or 5x minus 6 equals 0. So once you get into factored form, either one of your factors is 0 or the other one's 0. Now, if the first factor is equal to 0, solve this equation. So 5x plus 6 equals 0, move the 6 to the other side, 5x equals minus 6. Get x by itself, divide both sides by 5, so x equals minus 6 over 5. But if this second factor is equal to 0, I can solve that too. Move the minus 6 over, so 5x equals 6. Divide both sides by 5, so x equals 6 over 5. Okay, so this is where my two answers come from. Negative 6 over 5 is negative 1.2. 6 over 5 is positive 1.2. So to solve this equation, I'm going to get two possible answers. Now, as far as writing a final answer, 6 over 5, 6 over 5, this one's negative, this one's positive, I can just write that as x equals plus or minus 6 over 5. Now, if instead of 6 over 5, you wrote 1.2, I'll allow it. But it's often just simpler to keep the fraction. Okay, here's another example. Solve by factoring again. 3x squared plus 7x equals 20. Notice this is equal to 20, not equal to 0. So I need to change this equation so that it's equal to 0 first. So I end up with 3x squared plus 7x minus 20 equals 0. Now that we have our equation equal to 0, now I can try to factor. Okay, is there a common factor? Well, this is 3, 7, and 20. There's no common factor there, so we're not going to do that. This is a trinomial. The coefficient in front of the x squared is not 1, so this is a complex trinomial. This is where we factor by decomposition, so decompose the middle term. I won't go through how to do that in detail. Again, if you need the details, go back to the previous lesson and find the part on complex trinomials. I'm just going to push ahead, assuming you know how to do the factoring here. Okay, so I decomposed the middle term into two terms that multiply to minus 60, add to 7, that's 12 and minus 5. Factor by grouping. X plus 4 is a common factor. I'm left with 3x minus 5. Okay, so now I have my factored form equal to 0, and just like before, if you're multiplying two factors together and your answer is 0, that means either your first factor is equal to 0 or your second factor is equal to 0. So I can write x plus 4 equals 0 or 3x minus 5 equals 0. Solve for x in each case, and I get my two different answers. So x is equal to minus 4 or x is equal to 5 over 3. The way I can write my final statement here is like this. And what that is, it's called set notation with the curly brackets. And what it means is x is equal to all the numbers listed in this set. Okay, so negative 4, comma, 5/3, it just means x is equal to both of those different numbers. Now that's all well and good if you can factor the equation. If you can't factor the equation, you're going to have to use the quadratic formula. So still a key thing is that your equation must equal 0, and it must be in this form in order for the quadratic formula to work. So a, b, and c just refer to the numbers in the equation. A is the coefficient in front of x squared, b is the coefficient in front of x, and c is the constant by itself. And the equation has to equal 0. Okay, so here's the quadratic formula written for you. you should have this written down so you can refer to it. The more you use it, you're going to probably remember it, but I don't require you to memorize it because I'm not testing if you can memorize a formula. I just want you to be able to use it. So x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all of that divided by 2a. Okay, so I'm going to go through my next example with the quadratic formula. Okay, so solve using the quadratic formula. Get an exact answer. When I say exact answer, I don't necessarily mean just write all the digits that you get in your calculator, because your calculator just ran out of room. It rounded your answer. When I say exact, I mean no rounding at all. And I'll get to that when we get to the end of this problem. But first, here's the equation. Right off the bat, make sure it's equal to 0. Right now it's equal to 30, so we need to adjust that. So I take that 30, I move it to the other side, now it's minus 30, and I've got like terms here, 10 minus 30, that's minus 20. So I end up with negative 5t squared plus 30t minus 20 equals 0. Now if it helps, you can go ahead and label a, b, and c, your coefficients and your constant, and then we can just start with the quadratic formula and plug in our numbers. So I'll replace b with 30, replace a with minus 5, and replace c with minus 20. So you'll end up with this. Now we do the math. So inside the square root, do this math first, and also do this multiplication. You should end up with this. Okay, now to get an exact answer, watch out. You're going to be tempted to take the square root of 500, and your calculator is going to tell you it's 22.36067978. But remember, your calculator just ran out of room. So the digits actually keep going, so we don't want to go ahead and just do the square root here because we're not going to get an exact answer. Now we can actually divide both of those two top terms by negative 10. Negative 30 divided by negative 10 is 3. Okay, then plus or minus. Okay, the square root of 500 divided by negative 10. All right, so because this 500 is in a square root, when we divide by 10, well, 10 is the square root of 100, so we're actually going to divide by the square root of 100. So square root of 500 divided by the square root of 100 is the square root of 5. So we end up with x is equal to 3 plus the square root of 5 or 3 minus the square root of 5 as our final answer. Here's another example. Solve using the quadratic formula, get an exact answer. The tricky part with this question is that this is not written in standard form, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So first we need to expand and simplify and put everything on one side to set the equation equal to 0. So 3x times 2x is 6x squared, 3x times minus 4 is minus 12x. X plus 3 squared, remember that's x plus 3 times x plus 3. So x times x is x squared, x times 3 is 3x, 3 times x is 3x, and 3 times 3 is 9. Now that I have everything expanded, I need to find my like terms and put them together. So I'm moving everything to one side. 6x squared minus 12x, but then I move this over is minus x squared. This is minus 3x, minus 3x, minus 9. I'm left with 0 on the right-hand side. Like terms, 6x squared minus x squared is 5x squared. Negative 12x minus 3x is minus 18x, and then minus 9. That's all equal to 0. Okay, so now I have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. I can use the quadratic formula and solve. So I plug in my values for a, b, and c. Just be careful, b is negative 18. So in the quadratic formula, it starts negative b, so it's negative 18, which ends up being positive 18. Okay, then we do the math in the brackets. It ends up being 504 under the square root. And on the bottom, 2 times 5, that's 10. So we end with this. X is equal to 18 plus or minus the square root of 504. All of that divided by 10. So that's how you get your two different answers, when you add this or when you subtract it. Now, if you have a keen eye, you can actually simplify this into lowest terms. 18 and 10 can be divided by 2, so we can reduce that to 9 over 5. And then the square root of 504, if we want to divide that by 2, remember, it's a square root. So divide by 2, that's the square root of 4. So the square root of 504 divided by the square root of 4 is square root of 126. Okay? Now, if you can get to this point here, I'd say you're good. If you can recognize how to get to this more simplified form, then that's even better. Now, the last thing I want to show you is this idea of the discriminant. So when I say discriminant, I'm talking about this part of the quadratic formula, the part that's inside the square root sign, the b squared minus 4ac. Remember, when I'm calculating x, I have to add or subtract this square root of the discriminant. Now, the square root of a negative number makes absolutely no sense, because you can't have a number multiplied by itself to give you a negative answer. So if this discriminant ends up being a negative value, then the solution doesn't work. There's no solution that will satisfy that. You cannot take the square root of a negative value. Also, if the discriminant is equal to 0, well, the square root of 0 is 0. So when we find out what x is, we're adding 0 and subtracting 0 to get our two different answers. Well, they're not going to be different answers. There's only going to be one answer, because whether you add or subtract 0, it makes no difference. Also, if your discriminant is positive, then you can take the square root of it, and if you add it or subtract it, you're going to get different answers. So if the discriminant is greater than 0, so if it's positive, you'll end up with two solutions, two answers to the equation. Or if you think about on a graph, you'd have two zeros, two x-intercepts, two roots. If your discriminant is equal to 0, then you're going to have one solution to your equation. You're going to have one x-intercept on your graph. And if you have a negative discriminant, then you're going to have 0 solutions in your equation. And here's my last example for this lesson. A word problem. A market researcher predicted that the profit function for the first year of a new business would be p of x equals negative 0.3x squared plus 3x minus 15, where x is based on the number of items produced. Will it be possible for the business to break even in its first year? Okay, so profit is making money. Break even, when it says to break even, that means your profit is 0. So all of your revenue and all of your expenses balance out so that you're making a 0 profit. So to answer this question, the profit is equal to 0. So really, I'm going to have an equation equal to 0. And it asks, will it be possible for the business to break even? So will there be a solution to this equation? So to answer this, I don't actually have to solve for x. I just need to figure out what the discriminant is. Is the discriminant positive, negative, or 0? Well, b squared minus 4ac. b is 3, a is negative 0.3, and c is negative 15. When I do the math, the discriminant is negative 9. So the discriminant is negative, therefore there's no solution. You cannot solve this equation, which means it is not possible for the business to break even. And now it's time to practice. So take what you've learned from the video and try the practice questions. If you get stuck or you're not sure what's going on, just let me know and I'll do my best to help.